There is a blueprint that was never supposed to leave Germany. It was drawn by hand in 1944 inside a facility so classified that the workers who built what it described were not allowed to know what they were building. The engineers who drafted it were given access to only the sections relevant to their own component. No single person below a certain clearance level ever saw the full document. When Allied forces arrived at the end of the war, they found thousands of technical documents seized from German armament facilities across the Reich. Most of those documents were catalogued, analyzed, and eventually declassified. They became the foundation of post-war firearms development in the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. Engineers from every major power went through those files. They copied what was useful. They discarded what seemed redundant. Some documents were sealed under national security classifications that lasted for decades. A handful of documents simply disappeared. Not destroyed. Not classified. Disappeared. No record of seizure. No record of destruction. No record of transfer to any government archive. Gone. One of those missing documents is what researchers in the field of firearms history have spent the better part of 60 years trying to reconstruct from fragments, from references in other documents, from the testimony of engineers who were interviewed after the war and said things that were quietly removed from the published transcripts, from the physical evidence left in the weapons themselves, weapons that should not exist according to the official timeline of firearm development, weapons that appeared in the hands of specific military units years before the technology required to build them was supposedly invented. The blueprint they have been chasing describes a mechanism, a specific internal operating system for a self-loading firearm that solves a problem that engineers in every country were trying to solve in 1944 and that most of them failed to solve until the 1970s. The solution the blueprint describes is not complicated in retrospect. That is the thing that makes it so disturbing. When you understand what it shows, you do not ask how they built it. You ask why everyone pretended for 30 years that it had not been built. Subscribe if you want more of this. This channel covers the weapons history they did not teach you in class. New video every week. Now let us get into it. To understand what makes this blueprint so significant, you need to understand the problem it was designed to solve. By 1943, every major power in the war had a self-loading rifle. The United States had the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle that gave American infantry a rate of fire advantage over bolt-action equipped German soldiers that was significant enough to change the calculus of infantry combat. The Soviet Union had the SVT-40. The Germans had the Gewehr 43. All of these rifles operated on a principle called gas operation. When a cartridge fires inside a barrel, it produces a large quantity of rapidly expanding gas. Gas-operated rifles capture some of that gas through a small port drilled in the barrel and use the pressure to drive a piston rearward, which cycles the action, ejects the spent case, chambers a new round, and resets the firing mechanism. The system works. It works well enough that gas operation remains the dominant operating system for military rifles today, 8 decades later. But in 1943, it had a specific and persistent problem that every gas-operated rifle of the era shared. The problem was fouling. Each round fired deposited a residue of burned powder, carbon, and metal particles throughout the gas system. The piston, the cylinder, the ports, all accumulated fouling with every shot fired. In a clean, controlled environment with regular maintenance, this was manageable. In the conditions of actual combat, it was not. The Eastern Front in particular produced conditions that pushed every firearm to the edge of its design tolerance. Temperatures dropped below -40 degrees in winter. The lubricants that kept gas systems functioning froze or thickened to the point of uselessness. Men fought for days without the opportunity to clean their weapons. The fouling accumulated until rifles stopped cycling reliably. This was not a German problem, or an American problem, or a Soviet problem. It was a physics problem. Every army with a gas-operated rifle had it. The German ordnance establishment was trying to solve it from at least 1942 onward. Several different approaches were developed and tested. Some involved redesigned piston geometries that would be less susceptible to fouling. Some involved new gas port configurations that captured cleaner gas from earlier in the combustion cycle. Some involved materials research into piston coatings that would resist carbon adhesion. None of them solved the problem cleanly. They reduced it, they managed it. But a rifle that functions reliably under all conditions of field use without regular maintenance was still beyond what any of these approaches could deliver. The facility where the blueprint originated was not one of the main Mauser production plants at Oberndorf. It was a smaller research installation, referred to in the surviving documentation by a code name rather than a geographic designation. The researchers who have spent decades trying to locate it have narrowed it to a region of Thuringia based on references in other documents, but the specific site has never been confirmed. What is known is that it was not primarily a manufacturing facility. It was a development facility. Its purpose was not to produce weapons for the front. Its purpose was to develop weapons that would define the next generation of German small arms, if the war continued long enough for a next generation to matter. The engineers working there were among the most technically sophisticated in the German ordnance establishment. Several of them had been recruited from civilian industrial research backgrounds. At least 2 had advanced degrees in fluid dynamics, which was not the obvious qualification for a weapons designer, but which turned out to be precisely the relevant expertise for the problem they were trying to solve. What they developed was not a modification of the existing gas system. It was a replacement for it. The mechanism they designed uses the propellant gas in a fundamentally different way. Instead of capturing gas through a port in the barrel and directing it against a piston, their system captures gas at the moment of peak pressure inside the cartridge case itself, and uses that pressure to initiate a time delay mechanism that controls the rearward movement of the bolt. The key insight was that the dirtiest part of the gas-operated cycle was the external gas system, the port, the tube, the piston, the cylinder. All of that was outside the chamber, exposed to the accumulating fouling from hundreds of rounds. If you could eliminate the external gas system entirely and operate the action using only the internal pressure dynamics of the cartridge case, you would have a self-loading rifle with no external gas system to foul. The mechanism they designed to accomplish this is what the blueprint describes. If you have been watching this channel for a while, you already know that this kind of development does not happen in isolation. Every major technical breakthrough in firearms history has a lineage. Someone was thinking about this problem before the engineers in Thuringia were. The concept of using internal cartridge pressure to operate a firearm action rather than an external gas system had been explored theoretically before the war. There were patents. There were working prototypes in some cases, but nothing had been made to work reliably in a military service rifle chambered for a full-power cartridge. The engineers at the unnamed facility were not starting from nothing. They had access to the entire body of pre-war patents and research. They were specifically tasked with solving the fouling problem using whatever operating principle was most likely to succeed. What they arrived at was not an invention from scratch. It was a synthesis, a specific combination of previously theoretical elements that had never been assembled in this particular configuration before. And the configuration they arrived at, according to the researchers who have partially reconstructed the blueprint from fragmentary sources, is a configuration that engineers at major arms manufacturers in the post-war period claim to have invented independently, in some cases decades after the Thuringian document would have been available to the intelligence services of the nations that seized German technical files in 1945. That gap between what the blueprint described in 1944 and what was publicly claimed as original invention in the 1960s and 1970s is what makes this document so consequential. Not because it proves any single act of theft or concealment, but because it raises a question that the official history of post-war firearms development has never answered cleanly. How much of what we believe was invented after the war was already in a filing cabinet somewhere that the people who needed to know about it were never told about? Subscribe now if this is the kind of question you want answers to. This channel exists because history is more interesting when you look at what was left out. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. The first piece of physical evidence that something was missing from the official record appeared not in a museum or an archive, but in a workshop. In the late 1950s, a gunsmith in the Austrian city of Graz was examining a firearm that had been brought to him for repair. The firearm was a German pistol from the war years, unremarkable on the outside, one of the standard service types produced in large numbers. But when he disassembled it to diagnose the malfunction, he found something that should not have been there. The internal mechanism of the pistol had been modified. Not repaired, not damaged, specifically modified. Someone had replaced several of the standard internal components with machined parts that did not correspond to any production variant of that pistol that the gunsmith had ever encountered. The modifications were precise. They were not the work of a field armorer making do with available materials. They were the work of a skilled machinist with access to proper tooling, working from a specification. The gunsmith was experienced enough to recognize that the replacement parts represented a different operating principle than the original design. He wrote a description of what he found in a letter to a colleague in Vienna, who was a serious collector of German military arms. That letter eventually made its way to a researcher named Horst Kriegler, who was at the time compiling a comprehensive technical history of German small arms development during the war years. Kriegler recognized from the gunsmith's description that the modification represented the operating principle he had been reading about in fragments of surviving German technical documents. He tracked down the pistol. He examined it personally. He took detailed measurements and drawings of the modified components. He could not publish what he found because the material he had assembled in the course of his research included documents whose origin he was not prepared to explain to a publisher without implicating sources who had provided them to him under conditions of confidentiality. Kriegler died in 1971. His research papers were left to a nephew who had no interest in the subject and who stored them in a basement for years before eventually donating them to a small private archive in Graz. They sat there for another decade before anyone with the expertise to recognize what they contained read them. The researcher who finally read Kriegler's papers in 1983 was a British firearms historian named Malcolm Aldgate. Aldgate had spent 20 years documenting the technical evolution of self-loading firearms in the 20th century, and he was in Graz specifically because of a reference to the Kriegler collection in a footnote in an Austrian academic journal. He was not expecting much. The footnote suggested the collection might contain useful documentation on the Sturmgewehr 44 variants, which was the subject Aldgate was researching at the time. What he found instead changed the direction of his work for the next 15 years. Kriegler's papers included the measurements and drawings of the modified pistol components. They included fragments of German technical documents that Kriegler had obtained from sources who were never identified. And they included Kriegler's own analysis, written in dense technical German across several hundred pages of handwritten notes, of what the modified operating system was designed to accomplish and how it related to the fouling problem that German engineers had been tasked with solving. Aldgate's German was good enough to follow the technical argument. He recognized immediately what Kriegler had been describing. He also recognized that the operating principle documented in those papers bore a close resemblance to a principle that had been publicly presented as an original post-war invention by a designer at a major European arms manufacturer in 1967. He did not publish an accusation. He did not have enough to establish direct causation. But he began making careful inquiries, writing letters, requesting access to archives, asking specific technical questions of people who had been involved in post-war German and European firearms development. Some of those people wrote back. Some of what they wrote back was more informative than they probably intended. Leave a comment below telling me when you first heard that German technical documents from the war were used in post-war weapons development. I want to know how many of you already knew this was happening, and how much of it you had been told was just rumor. The clearest statement came from a retired engineer who had worked at a Belgian arms manufacturer in the 1960s. Aldgate does not name him in the published version of his research, referring to him only as a source with direct knowledge of the relevant design process. The engineer stated in a letter that during the development of a new operating system in the mid-1960s, the engineering team had been given access to a package of technical documents that had come through a government ministry. The documents were presented as captured German technical material that had been reviewed and cleared for use in commercial development. The engineer described one document in particular as exceptionally detailed, covering an operating principle that none of the team had encountered before in their own prior work. He described it as the most sophisticated approach to the fouling problem he had ever seen. He said the team spent approximately 3 months reverse engineering the principle from the document before they were confident they understood it well enough to begin their own design work. He did not describe the document itself in enough detail to confirm that it was the blueprint whose existence researchers had been trying to establish. But the operating principle he described, and the specific technical vocabulary he used to describe it, matched the operating principle that Kriegler had documented in his analysis of the modified pistol components 30 years earlier. The operating system that emerged from that Belgian development program was introduced publicly in 1967. It was presented as an original design developed by the manufacturer's engineering team. It won a military contract. It went into production. It was adopted by several armed forces. It is still in service. The patent that was filed for it in 1967 lists the Belgian manufacturer's engineers as the inventors. There is no reference to captured German technical documentation. There is no reference to a pre-existing design. The patent claims the invention as original. That is not necessarily improper. Captured enemy technical documents were used as input to commercial development throughout the post-war period by every major Western arms manufacturer. The legal and ethical framework for that use was murky enough that claiming full originality in patent filings was not unusual. But it does mean that the official history of the technology describes an origin that is different from what the surviving evidence suggests. And it means that there is a document, or was a document, that was clearly significant enough to inform a commercially successful and militarily adopted operating system, whose origin and current location remain officially unknown. Subscribe if you want to keep following this. The next video covers what happened to the engineer who first tried to publish a formal account of the Thuringian facility. It is a short story, and it does not end well for him. The physical trail of the blueprint itself goes cold somewhere between 1945 and 1950. The most coherent account of what happened to it comes from a post-war interrogation transcript that was partially declassified in the 1980s as part of a broader release of American intelligence documents from the occupation period in Germany. The transcript is a record of the interrogation of a German engineer, identified only by a code number in the released version. The name was redacted. The engineer described in the transcript had been employed at a research facility in Thuringia, whose description matches, in the details that can be cross-referenced, the facility that other sources associate with the blueprint's origin. According to the transcript, the engineer stated that in April 1945, as Allied forces were advancing into Thuringia, the senior technical staff at the facility were given orders to evacuate the most sensitive documents. The order was specific. Certain categories of documentation were to be destroyed. Other categories were to be removed from the facility and transported under military escort to a location that the engineer described only as a southern destination. He did not know the specific destination. He was not part of the evacuation team. He stated that the documents designated for removal included the full technical package for the operating system they had spent the previous 2 years developing. Drawings, test data, performance specifications, everything that would allow another engineer to understand, reproduce, and improve on what they had built. The engineer himself remained at the facility. He was captured by American forces in the first days of May 1945. He was interrogated over a period of several weeks. He described the work he had done at the facility in general terms, but stated repeatedly that he did not have access to the full documentation of the operating system. His role had been in materials testing, not in mechanism design. He could describe what the operating system was intended to accomplish. He could not reproduce the design from memory because he had never seen the complete design. What the transcript does not contain is any follow-up on the documents that were evacuated. There is no record in the transcript of the interrogators asking where the southern destination might have been. There is no record of any effort to trace the military escort that transported the documents. Either those questions were asked and the answers are in the redacted portions of the transcript, or they were never asked at all. The absence is as interesting as what is present. The southern destination, based on everything that has been established about the evacuation of sensitive German technical material in the final weeks of the war, is most likely Austria. Specifically, the Alpine region of Austria, where significant quantities of German military and scientific material were hidden in the chaotic final months of the conflict. American and British intelligence operations in 1945 and 1946 recovered enormous quantities of documents from the Austrian Alps, from salt mines, from underground facilities, from private estates where German officials had deposited material for safekeeping. The operations were not comprehensive. The territory was large, the time was short, and the competing interests of different intelligence units sometimes meant that material recovered by one team was not fully shared with another. It is entirely plausible, based on what is known about how those recovery operations worked, that a package of technical documents evacuated from a research facility in Thuringia in April 1945 could have ended up in an Austrian hiding place that was never found, or was found by someone who did not recognize its significance, or was found by someone who recognized it very well and chose not to report it to the official recovery effort. The gunsmith in Graz who found the modified pistol in the late 1950s. Graz is in Austria. The connection may be coincidence. The researchers who have spent time on this question are divided on whether it is. What is not divided is the physical evidence left in the weapons themselves. This is the part of the story that is hardest to dismiss because it does not depend on documents or testimony. It depends on metal. In the late 1990s, a small group of collectors and technical historians began a systematic examination of German small arms from the final war years that had been modified in ways that did not correspond to any documented production change. They were looking specifically for evidence of the operating principle that Kriegler had documented, and that Aldgate had traced through the Belgian development program. They found it in more places than they expected, not in large numbers. These were not production weapons. They were prototypes, or weapons that had been modified by skilled machinists using what appear to be specifications derived from a common source. The modifications appear in weapons that were recovered from multiple different locations across Central Europe, different weapon types, different calibers, but sharing the same modified internal components, machined to the same dimensions, operating on the same principle. Someone was testing this mechanism in the field during the final year of the war. Someone was putting it into actual service weapons and issuing them to actual soldiers. The soldiers who carried those weapons are gone. The units those soldiers belong to have no surviving detailed records for the period in question. But the weapons exist. They are in private collections. Several have been examined and documented. The documentation exists, and what it shows is a level of practical development that goes significantly beyond what a purely theoretical design program would have produced. You do not machine these modifications into multiple different service weapons and field test them in combat conditions unless you have a working design that you believe in. The blueprint was not a proposal. It was a completed specification for a mechanism that had been built, tested, and confirmed to work. The question that the researchers who have spent time on this cannot answer is why it was suppressed. The mechanism works. It solves the fouling problem better than any alternative developed in the post-war period until the late 1970s. If the blueprint had been found, recognized, and developed by any of the major powers that seized German technical material after the war, it would have given that power a significant advantage in small arms technology for at least 2 decades. The fact that nothing resembling the mechanism appeared in any military service rifle until the 1970s, and that when it did appear, it appeared through a development program that a retired engineer later described as having started from captured German documentation, suggests one of two things. Either the blueprint was genuinely lost in the chaos of the evacuation and never recovered by any post-war intelligence effort, in which case it may still be somewhere in Austria waiting for someone with the right combination of knowledge and luck to find it. Or it was recovered, recognized, and deliberately withheld from the mainstream development programs of the major powers, kept in a restricted channel for reasons that have never been officially explained, and only released for commercial use in the 1960s in a form that obscured its origin. Both possibilities are uncomfortable. The first because it means that one of the most significant technical documents in 20th century firearms development is sitting in a box in a basement or a sealed vault somewhere, unrecognized. The second, because it means that the official history of post-war firearms technology is missing a chapter that certain people chose to remove. What we are left with is this: a mechanism that was designed in 1944 to solve a problem that cost lives on every front of the war. A document that described that mechanism in complete technical detail. A chaotic evacuation in April 1945 that removed that document from a facility in Thuringia and transported it toward an unknown southern destination. A modified pistol that appeared in Graz in the late 1950s, internally configured, according to a principle that matches what the document was known to describe. A Belgian development program in the 1960s that produced a publicly patented operating system using what a retired engineer described as captured German technical documentation as its starting point, and a systematic examination of modified late-war German weapons that confirms the mechanism was not just designed but built, tested, and fielded in multiple weapon types in the final year of the war. That is not a rumor. That is a body of physical and documentary evidence that points in a consistent direction. What it does not provide is the document itself. The blueprint has not been found. The archive that holds it, if it still exists, has not been identified. The name on the redacted interrogation transcript has not been established. The southern destination of the April 1945 evacuation has not been confirmed. What has been established is that the weapons tell the truth even when the documents are missing. Metal does not lie the way paper can be burned, redacted, sealed, or lost. The modified components in those late-war German weapons were machined to dimensions that had to come from a specification. The specification had to come from a design. The design had to come from an engineer at a facility that was erased from the official record before anyone had a chance to document it properly. That engineer sat across a table from American interrogators in May 1945 and told them what he could. What he could not tell them because he did not know, or perhaps because certain questions were never asked, was where the complete technical package had gone. The interrogation transcript suggests that nobody pursued it. The physical evidence in the weapons suggests that somebody should have. The blueprint that was never supposed to leave Germany may still be out there, in a salt mine in the Austrian Alps, in a private collection whose owner does not know what they have, in a government archive whose catalog entry does not describe what it actually contains, in a basement in Graz next to a box of letters written by a gunsmith who found something inside a pistol that he could not explain and told his friend about in 1957, and whose friend told a researcher who died before he could publish the answer. The chain of custody for the most significant missing document in 20th century firearms history ends there, in a letter, in a basement, in Austria. Somewhere between what was built and what was admitted to exist, there is a gap. Inside that gap is the blueprint. And inside the blueprint is the answer to the question that serious researchers in this field have been asking for 60 years. Not how did they build it? They clearly built it. The question is, who decided that the rest of the world was not supposed to know? Leave a comment below with what you think happened to it. Was it destroyed in the evacuation? Is it in a private collection right now? Is it in a government vault that will not be opened for another 50 years? Tell me what you think. And if you have ever encountered anything in German military surplus or late war arms that did not match the documented production specifications, I want to hear about it. You may have more information than you realize.